They called it island hopping. On paper, it was a cold, calculated military strategy, leapfrogging across the Pacific, bypassing Japanese strongholds, strangling them by isolation, and establishing new bases ever closer to Japan. But to those who lived it on both sides, it felt like a creeping tide of death. Japanese garrisons marooned on bypassed islands were left to starve, cut off from supply and hope. American soldiers advancing from one coral atoll to the next walked into walls of fire, knowing the enemy had sworn to die before surrender. It was efficient, it was merciless. And for many Japanese soldiers it was terrifying, not just for the bullets, but for the realization that the tide of war could no longer be turned. I was there, one of the thousands of boots trudging through the Pacific heat. When we landed on Kwajalein, the air was already thick with smoke from naval bombardments. We'd been told the Japanese would fight to the last man, and they did. You could feel it in the ground, bunkers dug deep, tunnels carved into coral, machine guns that didn't stop until silence meant the men inside were dead. But it wasn't the fighting alone that unsettled us. It was the look in the enemy's eyes. They weren't just defending an island, they were realizing something. America wasn't going to fight them everywhere. We were picking islands like stepping stones, leaving the others to rot in the sun. Soldiers we captured whispered about comrades abandoned on neighboring islands, thousands left without food, medicine, or reinforcements, doomed to die slowly. The first time I saw it up close was on Tarawa. After days of bloodshed, we finally pushed through the defenses. And there, buried under rubble and sand, were enemy soldiers who hadn't seen fresh supplies in weeks. Their bodies were skeletal, their faces gaunt, yet they still clutched their rifles, ready to die in place. They weren't terrified of us. They were terrified of being forgotten. Terrified of being bypassed, marooned like so many others. The higher-ups told us this was the genius of the strategy. Why bleed for every square mile when you can let hunger and disease finish the job for you? But for the men in the field, it gave the war a haunted edge. Every time we landed somewhere new, we wondered, how many soldiers are still alive just over the horizon, waiting in silence, cut off and desperate? On the march inland, I remember the jungle sounds falling away. The deeper we went, the stranger it felt. No birds, no insects, only the smell of decay. One of our scouts muttered, "They're dying out here without firing a shot." And in that moment, I understood what this war really meant for them. The Japanese weren't being pushed back island by island. They were being abandoned piece by piece like bones scattered in the ocean. And it terrified them. Because once you know your army will bypass you, you stop fighting for victory. You start fighting just to be remembered, and that desperation made every battle more savage. Tarawa was the first time the strategy revealed its true cost. The island itself was tiny, barely 3 miles long, a strip of coral surrounded by reefs. On the maps, it looked insignificant, just another dot in the Pacific. But we were told it was a fortress, bristling with Japanese defenses. "They've promised we won't take it in 100 years, one officer said, quoting the enemy's propaganda. None of us laughed. When our Higgins boats hit the reef and stalled, we realized the mistake. The tide was too low. We had to wade through chest-deep water for hundreds of yards, rifles held above our heads, while machine guns opened fire from bunkers we couldn't even see. The sea turned red. Bodies floated beside us before we even reached the beach. I'll never forget the sound. Bullets snapping the surface of the water, screams, and the metallic whine of mortars dropping in. For 76 hours, Tarawa was hell. We crawled through sand choked with barbed wire and corpses. Japanese soldiers fought from concrete pillboxes, underground tunnels and dugouts reinforced with palm logs. The naval bombardment we thought had leveled the island had done little. When you peered inside a shattered bunker, you always saw the same thing, dark eyes staring back, a bayonet gleaming and a soldier ready to die in the dark. The documentary accounts would later describe it as the most intense battle per square mile in the Pacific War. They were right. More than 1,000 Marines died for that speck of coral. The Japanese lost nearly every man they had, over 4,000, but it didn't feel like victory, it felt like a warning. If every island was this, how many of us would live to see the war's end? But from the Japanese perspective, Tarawa revealed something even darker. They had poured everything into their beachline defenses, trusting that barbed wire, machine guns, and sheer courage would bleed us dry. Instead, we took it in days. When word reached other garrisons that Tarawa had fallen, shock spread. Soldiers realized that no matter how strong their defenses were, America would keep coming. Kwajalein came next, another coral atoll, but this time the lessons of Tarawa were burned into our commanders' minds. The bombardment was longer, more precise. We went in knowing the Japanese would not retreat, that every crater and bunker had to be cleared by hand. I remember kicking open a trench and finding 2 Japanese soldiers crouched together, rifles in their laps. They didn't move. One pulled a grenade to his chest, eyes wide, lips muttering something I couldn't hear. We ran. The explosion shook the trench behind us, throwing sand into our hair. That was the kind of fight it was, enemies choosing death over capture. Narrators would later say that Kwajalein marked the end of Japan's beach defense strategy. After that, they would dig deeper, using caves and jungles, forcing us to root them out like shadows. But for us on the ground, Kwajalein was just more proof of the nightmare. This war wasn't about taking ground, it was about surviving long enough to take the next. Between battles, rumors spread about what island hopping really meant. We heard about bypassed garrisons, places like Rabaul, where tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were stranded, cut off from supplies. At first, some of us thought it was a mercy. Better to leave them alone than storm another fortress. But the truth filtered through slowly. Those men weren't surrendering. They were withering away, starving, rotting on islands that had become prisons. Every bypassed soldier was a ghost waiting to die. I remember staring across the lagoon one night, the stars reflected on the water like shattered glass. One of our sergeants lit a cigarette, hands trembling from exhaustion. "Somewhere out there," he said, "there's an island full of dead men walking. They just don't know they're dead yet." Nobody answered. We all knew it was true. The Japanese, for their part, felt it even more sharply. Later records and testimonies revealed the dread that spread among their ranks. Soldiers began to whisper that America's strategy was not just military, but psychological. To be bypassed was worse than being killed in battle. It meant your honor dissolved slowly, eaten away by hunger and isolation, while the war moved on without you. We didn't see their fear directly, not then. But we saw the results. Captured letters described soldiers begging to be allowed to fight, begging not to be abandoned. One note found on a corpse in a bunker read, "If we cannot fight, then we are already dead men. Let the Emperor know we were ready to die." That kind of desperation made each battle fiercer than the last. At Kwajalein, after the final push, the smell of death clung to the air for weeks. Piles of burned corpses, collapsed bunkers filled with smoke, waves carrying bloated bodies to the beach. Some of us began to think we could hear them at night. Voices in the surf, whispers in the palm trees. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was guilt, maybe it was just the memory of how many thousands had died in so small a place. But for us, island hopping wasn't just strategy anymore, it was haunting. The brass explained it coldly. "Every step puts us closer to Japan," they told us. "Every island we take is one step closer to ending the war." We nodded. We followed orders. But inside we carried the weight of what it meant, that we were carving a path across a graveyard, and that the further we went, the heavier the ghosts would follow. Tarawa and Kwajalein were just the beginning. The real terror would come later, on the Marianas, where entire families chose death over surrender, and on Saipan's cliffs, where fear itself became the enemy. And as we left Kwajalein behind, preparing for the next step, one thought gnawed at us all. The Japanese weren't just fighting to hold islands. They were fighting against the realization that they were already lost. By mid-1944, the strategy of island hopping had carved a scar across the Pacific. Each step closer to Japan carried not only military consequences but psychological ones. Tarawa and Kwajalein had proven that the Japanese defenses could be cracked. But the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian and Guam, revealed something darker, that entire societies could collapse under the weight of America's advance. For the US command, the Marianas were crucial. From those islands, long-range B-29 bombers could reach Japan's home islands directly. Taking them would mean striking the heart of the empire. For the Japanese defenders, that realization carried the weight of doom. Saipan wasn't just another island. It was home to thousands of Japanese civilians, families, farmers and workers who had settled there long before the war. It was a fragment of Japan itself, transplanted into the Pacific. When we landed on Saipan in June, the world seemed to end in fire. Naval guns thundered for days, blasting the coastline until the palms burned like torches. Aircraft roared overhead, bombing inland positions. From the decks of our transports, we watched the island turn black with smoke. Some of us thought the bombardment would wipe the defenders out before we ever set foot ashore. We were wrong. The moment our boots hit the sand, machine guns rattled from concealed positions. Mortars arced in, shredding men before they could even raise their rifles. I remember a buddy falling beside me, his pack exploding with flames as a round hit his canteen. We pressed forward anyway, because hesitation meant death. The Japanese fought from caves, pillboxes, and spider holes, erupting from the earth like phantoms. At night, banzai charges crashed against our lines, waves of screaming soldiers rushing into our guns, choosing death over surrender. But what shook me most wasn't just the enemy soldiers, it was the civilians. I'll never forget the first time I saw them, women clutching children, old men carrying nothing but a kitchen knife, their eyes wide with terror. They weren't fighting us, they were running from us. Rumors had spread among the civilians that we would torture them, kill them, dishonor them in ways too terrible to imagine. Japanese propaganda had painted us as monsters, and so when the fighting drew closer to their villages, they fled, not toward us, but away. On the cliffs of Saipan, we found out what that meant. The sound of gunfire echoed through the night, but it was joined by something worse, the cries of families as they hurled themselves into the sea. Mothers clutched infants and leapt from the rocks. Fathers pushed wives and children over the edge before following. I can still hear it. The screams carried by the wind, the splash of bodies hitting the waves, the silence after. We tried to stop them. Loudspeakers in Japanese urged them to come down, to surrender, to live. Some did, but most did not. They believed death was the only escape, and as we watched horrified, we realized that this war was no longer just soldier against soldier. It was dragging entire populations into madness. The official reports later called it mass suicides. For us on the ground, it was a nightmare etched into memory. Some Marines wept openly. Others turned away, unable to watch. I remember one sergeant yelling, "We didn't come here for this." But the truth was we had, because island hopping wasn't just about terrain. It was about breaking the will of an empire. And on Saipan, we saw that will snap. The Japanese commanders fought with the same ferocity as their men. When defeat became inevitable, many officers committed ritual suicide, choosing the blade over capture. Others led final, desperate charges into our lines, waves of men armed with little more than bayonets and grenades. On the last night, over 3,000 Japanese soldiers rushed us in one massive banzai attack. They came screaming out of the jungle, overwhelming positions, cutting through wounded and medics alike. I fired until my rifle jammed, then used my bayonet until my arms shook. By morning, the ground was soaked with blood, theirs and ours. The narrators would later say Saipan was the turning point. For the first time, the Japanese people themselves, not just the soldiers, felt the shadow of America's island hopping strategy. Families who had believed in the Empire's strength saw the truth, that no matter how many lives were sacrificed, the tide would not turn. Saipan had fallen, and with it, a piece of Japan's soul. I remember after the battle, walking through a burned-out village. The houses were empty, the streets silent except for the buzzing of flies. In one hut, a pot of rice still sat on a fire gone cold. In another, a child's toy, a carved wooden horse, lay beside a doorway splattered with blood. It struck me then. This wasn't just about soldiers anymore. It was about erasing a way of life. Captured documents revealed what Japanese soldiers had feared most. Not the battles, not even death, but abandonment. Those stationed on bypassed islands knew they would die without ever firing another shot. Those on Saipan knew that if they lost here, the war would come to their families' doorsteps, and so they fought with the desperation of men trying to hold back the ocean. But no one can hold back the ocean forever. By the time the fighting ended, over 30,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Thousands of civilians had chosen suicide. The island was a graveyard, its cliffs marked forever by the tragedy that unfolded there. For us, it was a victory, but it felt hollow. We had taken another step toward Japan, yes, But the ghosts we carried from Saipan would never leave us. I still see them sometimes when I close my eyes. The cliffs, the shadows falling, the cries in the dark. And I wonder, did they jump because they feared us? Or because they knew the war had already been lost? For the Japanese, Saipan was more than defeat. It was a revelation. America's island-hopping strategy wasn't just crushing their armies, it was breaking their spirit, convincing them that the empire's future was already gone. And in that terror, in that despair, the seeds of something even more desperate began to grow, the kamikaze. By late 1944, America's island-hopping strategy had cut deep into Japan's defensive line. The Marianas were gone, their cliffs echoing with the memory of mass suicides. Now, the next target loomed, the Philippines. For the Japanese High Command, losing them meant losing the lifeline of oil and resources from the south. For the Americans, retaking them was both strategic and symbolic. General MacArthur had promised he would return, and now he was making good on that promise. We came ashore at Leyte in October. The seas around us churned with the largest naval battle the world had ever seen. Over 200,000 sailors clashed in what would be called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Aircraft screamed overhead. Torpedoes ripped through destroyers, and entire carriers erupted into fireballs that lit the horizon. To us on the ground, it felt like the earth itself was shaking, the sky aflame with war. The Japanese had thrown everything into stopping us, but it wasn't enough. Their navy, once feared across the Pacific, was shattered. Their ships lay burning, their carriers sinking beneath the waves. The Empire's ability to fight at sea was effectively broken. And yet, instead of surrender, they found something darker to unleash: the kamikaze. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a mistake. A Japanese plane came in low, wobbling as if crippled. We expected it to dive away at the last second, as pilots always did when faced with walls of anti-aircraft fire. But this one didn't. It roared straight into the deck of a carrier, slamming in with a thunderous explosion. The blast sent fire rolling across the ship, black smoke pouring into the sky. There was no escape, no chance of survival. The pilot had chosen to die, and to take as many of us as he could with him. At first, we couldn't believe it. Pilots were supposed to fight to win, not to die. But soon it became clear this was no accident. This was a new weapon, born of desperation and terror. They called it kamikaze, the divine wind. For us, it felt like madness, given wings. On Leyte, the ground war was just as brutal. Japanese soldiers had learned from Saipan. They didn't waste themselves on futile beach defenses. Instead, they pulled back into the jungles, the hills, the rice paddies. They fought from concealed positions, ambushing us at night, melting away by day. Every step forward was met with sniper fire, grenades, and traps hidden in the mud. The air reeked of damp earth and rotting bodies. I remember advancing through a mangrove swamp, the water up to our knees. The trees hung low, the light barely breaking through the canopy. A buddy ahead of me tripped a wire, and in an instant the swamp erupted. A mine, a grenade, maybe both. He vanished in the blast, the water turning red around the shredded roots. The Japanese weren't just fighting us anymore. They were using the land itself as a weapon. At night, we lay awake listening to the sounds. Frogs croaking, insects buzzing, and somewhere out there, the faint murmur of Japanese voices. Sometimes they'd crawl close to our lines, whispering in English, "Marine, you die tomorrow." Other times they'd scream banzai and rush us in the dark. Sleep became impossible. The jungle felt alive, watching us, waiting to strike. But even worse than the jungle was the sky. Every time we saw a Japanese plane overhead, fear knotted our guts. Was it just a fighter? Or was it coming for us, fueled not by survival, but by death? Entire ships vanished in flames as kamikazes dove from the clouds. Sailors said it was like being hunted by ghosts. You couldn't reason with them, couldn't scare them, couldn't stop them. They were already dead the moment they took off. Documentary accounts later described the kamikaze as Japan's final weapon of despair. To us, it felt like the embodiment of their terror. Island hopping had cornered them, step by step, until they saw no path left but suicide. If they couldn't win, they would make dying itself into a weapon. and that thought chilled us more than anything else in the war. One night on Leyte, after a brutal day of fighting, I sat with a group of Marines eating cold rations from a tin. None of us spoke much. The jungle was too quiet, the air too heavy. Finally, one of the guys muttered, "What kind of men strap themselves into a bomb and call it honor?" No one answered, because deep down we knew the truth. They weren't doing it out of strength. They were doing it because they were terrified. Terrified of surrender, terrified of being bypassed, terrified of disappearing like so many of their comrades on forgotten islands. The Empire had convinced them that death was better than dishonor, and they believed it with every breath. The Philippines bled us dry. The fighting dragged on for months through jungles, villages, and mountains. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, just as they had been on Saipan. Japanese soldiers hid among them, drawing us into battles where women and children became unwilling shields. It was war at its ugliest, and it showed us that the further we advanced, the more desperate the enemy became. By the time Leyte was secure, thousands of Japanese were dead, thousands more cut off in pockets that would never surrender. The seas around the Philippines were littered with wreckage, twisted steel rising from the waves like tombstones. The skies still smelled of smoke, and though we had won, the cost was so high that victory felt more like survival than triumph. The narrators would later say the Philippines campaign marked the beginning of the end for Japan. Their navy was crippled, their pilots had been turned into weapons of suicide. Their soldiers were still fierce, but they were fighting for an empire that was already unraveling. I still remember standing on a ridge, looking out over the Philippine jungle as the sun went down. The land was beautiful, green and endless, but scarred with fire and craters. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay Japan itself. For the first time I realized we were almost there. The strategy of island hopping had worked. Step by step, graveyard by graveyard, we had carved a path to the empire's doorstep. But I also realized something else. The closer we got, the worse it was going to become. Because a cornered enemy is the most dangerous of all. And Japan was cornered now, more than ever. The kamikazes were just the beginning. By 1945, the island hopping campaign had done its work. The map of the Pacific was dotted with stepping stones of American bases: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Leyte. Each one had cost blood, each one had left scars, but each one had pushed us closer to Japan. Now only a few obstacles remained before the home islands themselves, and the greatest of those obstacles was Okinawa. Okinawa was different. This wasn't a coral atoll or a jungle outpost. This was Japanese soil, less than 400 miles from the mainland. A population of civilians lived here, over 300,000 souls caught in the crossfire. To take Okinawa would mean having a base for the final invasion of Japan itself. Everyone knew it. This was the last step before the empire's heart. We hit the beaches in April after days of naval bombardment. At first it seemed almost too easy. Resistance was light, the sand eerily quiet compared to Tarawa or Saipan. Some men even thought the Japanese had finally broken. But it was a trick. Instead of defending the beaches, they had pulled back into the hills and caves inland, waiting for us. And once we moved forward, the nightmare began. The rain fell for days, turning the island into a swamp of mud and blood. Hills rose before us, honeycombed with bunkers and tunnels. The Japanese had dug deep, creating labyrinths where they could vanish underground, only to reappear behind us. Every cave was a fortress. Every ridgeline was a killing field. We nicknamed one of them Sugarloaf Hill. It was just a mound of earth, but it ate men alive. We charged it again and again, losing hundreds each time, only to find more bunkers waiting. At night, the battlefield groaned with the cries of the wounded. Some begged for help. Others screamed in Japanese, their voices carrying through the rain. The lines between the living and the dead blurred in that mud. You couldn't tell where the bodies ended and the earth began. I remember crawling through trenches half filled with water, the stench of rot choking the air. My hands brushed something soft, and when I looked down, it wasn't mud. It was the face of a soldier, half buried, staring blankly through the rain. The civilians suffered most of all. Caught between two armies, many fled into caves, hiding in the dark with nothing but scraps of food. Some were forced out by Japanese troops, who ordered them to fight or die. Others were told lies. that Americans would torture and kill them. And so, just like on Saipan, many chose suicide. Families huddled at cliff edges, clutching grenades or each other, and leapt into the sea. I'll never forget seeing a mother with a child tied to her back vanish into the waves, her scream cut short by the crash of surf. We tried to stop them, shouting in Japanese that they would be safe, but fear is louder than reason. The Japanese soldiers themselves fought with a kind of fury I had never seen before. They weren't just defending an island, they were defending the threshold of their homeland. Every cave, every hill, every tree was contested. They used everything: artillery hidden in caves, machine guns set in impossible angles, even suicide charges from soldiers carrying satchel charges to blow up tanks. And above us, the kamikazes came again, wave after wave, hurling themselves into our ships offshore. One by one, destroyers and carriers burned, their hulks sinking into the grey sea. We lost men every day. Whole units were chewed apart by artillery or buried alive when bunkers collapsed. The mud never dried. The rain never stopped. By the end, we weren't fighting for glory or strategy anymore. We were fighting just to crawl another few yards forward, just to stay alive until the guns finally fell silent. The narrators later called Okinawa the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. Over 12,000 Americans killed, more than 100,000 Japanese dead, and tens of thousands of civilians lost. But those numbers don't tell you what it felt like to stand on that island, to smell the rot in the caves, to hear the cries of children in the dark, to know that the closer we got to Japan, the more impossible the fighting became. For the Japanese, Okinawa was a prophecy. If this much blood was spilled for one island, what would happen when the Americans came to the mainland? The answer was unthinkable, and that fear, the terror of what the invasion of Japan would mean, was one of the reasons the war ended the way it did. I remember after the last shots faded, standing on a ridge looking out over Okinawa. The hills were blackened with fire. The villages were gone. The sea was littered with wreckage. The rain had finally stopped, but the silence was worse than the thunder of guns. It felt like the island itself had died. We had taken Okinawa. The path to Japan was open. The island-hopping strategy had worked, ruthless, efficient, step by step, but it had left a trail of ghosts across the Pacific. Ghosts of soldiers who fought to the last breath. Ghosts of civilians who chose death over surrender. Ghosts of men like me who survived but never left those islands behind. Looking back, I wonder if terrified is even the right word. The Japanese weren't just afraid of America's island-hopping strategy. They were consumed by it, trapped in its shadow, watching their empire crumble piece by piece. By the time we reached Okinawa, terror wasn't just a reaction. It was the very air they breathed. And maybe that was the true power of island hopping. Not just the bases we built, not just the ground we captured, but the fear it spread, the realization that the war was unwinnable, that every island would fall, that even the home islands could not be spared. It broke them before the bombs ever did. When the war finally ended, some said it was the atomic blasts that forced Japan to surrender. Others argued it was the Soviet entry into the war. But for those of us who had marched through the Pacific, there was another truth. The island-hopping strategy had already shattered Japan's spirit long before the mushroom clouds. We had seen it in their eyes. We had heard it in their screams. We had carried it with us through the mud, the rain, and the fire. Okinawa was the last step, the last graveyard before the empire's heart. And though the war ended before we ever had to invade the home islands, I sometimes think the Japanese already knew how that invasion would end. Not in victory, not in honor, but in terror.